The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Hello, everyone. My name is Chris Lloyd. I'm Oxford Computer Group CTO, and thank you for attending the Governing Microsoft Teams webinar that we're going to have today. I'm going to go ahead and jump right into it because I've got a lot to cover. Teams is a pretty expansive product, but before we dive right into it, just a little pitch about who OCG is. We have a 16-year track record on deploying different identity solutions. We've been Microsoft Partner of the Year several times over, and we have all sorts of different services, whether it's planning and assessment, deployment services, or managed services, all around identity in the Microsoft stack and outside of it, because organizations have basically hooks into their identities flow throughout their systems. Before I get started, I wanted to start off the webinar with one poll just to see, and this is basically just asking, is your organization using Microsoft Teams, right? So if you're planning on it, then you pick the will be deploying soon, and I assume most of you are going to answer with the top two because I don't know why you would be joining a Teams webinar if you weren't either already using it or planning on using it. And that was confirmed. So go ahead, close that poll. So many of you probably already know this, but Microsoft Teams is basically Microsoft's almost window into Office 365 services. They put a lot of investment effort into this. Not only will it be a Skype for Business replacement with chat and VoIP, I'm not really going to talk too much about chat and VoIP on this webinar, but it's really the hub center for collaborating with not only internal resources but external resources. It can be customized in a variety of different ways, and it has basically security, which is built upon the Office 365 and Azure platforms. There's a variety of different clients. There's a web client. It's mainly most functional on Edge, Chrome, and Safari. There's a desktop client, which I think is pretty much the preferred mechanism of interacting with it, at least on the desktop. And then there's a mobile client for both Android and iOS. So when we look at a team is made up of an owner, and then there are members underneath that team. The owner is the person who's going to create the team, or it's been assigned to it if, depending on how the creation happens, let's say the creation is done by an administrator of the team and then an owner is assigned. And the owner can be multi-valued, so you can have multiple owners on a team. The members themselves are people that have been invited to join the team. And then there are guests. So we'll look at guests in a little bit further down in the presentation, because there's all sorts of different restrictions about, well, who can be invited as far as guests and what types of controls we can put around that. But these are generally users outside of your organization or outside of your Azure AD tenant, and they get added as business-to-business users inside of Azure AD. And so the core identity components that are in use within Team, obviously Azure AD, as it's the backbone for Office 365 and Microsoft Identity in the cloud. This encompasses both in the user space, the business to enterprise identities, and then the business to business identities. Groups are also a big part, because when you, in the back end, when you create a team, that's actually creating an Office 365 group. This is a special type of group that we'll talk about in the next slide. We're also using shared mailboxes and Exchange Online for these Office 365 groups, and that's going to relate into the e-discovery and archiving of the data from the team. OneDrive for Business is also in play here when we're talking about one-to-one chats and files are exchanged in that one-to-one chat. The files themselves are being stored in OneDrive for Business. And then each team is going to spawn a SharePoint site collection, which is where the document repository lives for when users upload a document to a team, and so it's hosted and stored within SharePoint. So we have to talk about groups, because groups are really the driving piece behind teams. And in a hybrid scenario, at an organization, there are 5 different group options, and we're familiar with I mean, potentially all of them, depending on where you are at your modern workplace process. And so we're very familiar with the on-premise AD groups, whether they be security groups or distribution groups, and then we have those in the cloud as well. Now, the groups from on-premise can be synchronized and be made to be Azure AD groups, whether they be security distribution. Now, the one we're really going to focus on today, and actually the only one we're going to focus on today because it's the only one that really relates to Teams, is Office 365 groups. And these groups are not synchronized from on-premise. They are created in the cloud, they live in the cloud, and they you can't convert an on-premise security or distribution group that's been synchronized to the cloud into an Office 365 group. You can convert cloud groups into that, and there's more details around that. But for what we're talking about today, it's Office 365 groups. This is a combination supergroup, right? So it's a combo of a security and distribution group. It provides a bunch of different features in Office 365, and it's integrated throughout the Office 365 and Microsoft Online services. So not only Teams, but it's being used in SharePoint, Power BI, Planner, you name it. It's basically very prevalent in an Office 365 environment. And they can be created from all of those different locations. So as we start to look at how do we govern who can create these groups, you'll notice that the restrictions, we have to be very cognizant if we put any restrictions in place, because we may impact other spaces in Office 365 or Microsoft Online services. So when I go to an organization and talk about teams, as far as an identity concept and governing those identities in teams, a lot of the questions that I get asked is who can create teams, so who can create those Office 365 groups. Can I add and restrict external members? So can I make it so that some teams have external members, but some are private? And how do I go through and attest to those users? And then what are the governance options for managing those teams? So not only with the external members, but also with the individuals in my organization. And what are the limitations of Microsoft Teams? So there's all sorts of new features that get rolled out. Those limitations are actually changing. Hopefully they're not changing as I'm speaking right now. So the last time I looked, I have a slide in here that talks about the limitations of Teams. So if you're looking at this in the future, you may want to go check on those limitations. And then how can I gain visibility and apply policies to the data that's actually stored within Teams? So this core set of questions, and there's more that come up, but these are really the highlights, and I hope to be able to answer them in this webinar today. And so starting out in our journey throughout the Teams environment here, who can create teams? And those of you that are using Teams today, I have a poll question before I get into this, and I want to know if you put any restrictions as to who can create teams in your organization. And there's a lot more that say yes than I thought. But it's sort of a mix. So just to clue you guys in, there's basically a mix. Nobody is unsure, but there is a leaning towards yes, and then there is some of you who are reporting no. So when we look at creating a team, the ideal interface that Microsoft would like people to go through is through the application. That means that users are able to open up the Teams application, click the new team button, decide some different options about whether the team might be public, which is free to join in any organization, whether or not it's private, meaning the owners are going to control that membership, and whether or not they're going to pick an existing Office 365 group that already exists. There also exists the concept of a template. So you can make templates for teams, for different repeatable teams in your organization. From the Azure side, because remember, this is all about Azure Active Directory in the background, there are certain controls that you can put in place First off, you can limit who creates teams. So limit it by who can create Office 365 groups. As I said before, this does impact who can create those groups in other Microsoft online services that are using Office 365 groups. So while your original intention about limiting who can create them might be for Teams, you might impact other applications. It's just something to keep in mind. There's also naming policies that could be put in place, and these are put in place via PowerShell, and they basically pull bits and pieces from a user's identity. For example, you might have a static prefix that you want to put on the team. You might put group, GRP, some prefix in the beginning, a string, and then you might want to use the provided text from the end user. So the end user is going to pick a group name. And then at the end of that, you may want to use the user's department, the cost center, the business unit to append to the end. There is a limitation on the length. It's 53, I think, characters long that you can have that. Or sorry, that's just the prefix. It's 53 characters long, sorry. So that's a way to put some structure to the team name. Keep in mind that users are going to be able to see this name. And so it has to make sense for them because it's going to show up in a list. And our organization has been using Teams for some time now, and the number of teams has exploded, and it's sometimes difficult to figure out what team was used for what because the naming policy either wasn't followed or the naming policy wasn't clear. The last section in here is Teams classification, and this can be enabled via PowerShell as well. And it basically, as an organization, you'll probably want to come together and figure out a classification that makes sense. This isn't used so much for end user, but visible to end user. It doesn't really impact what they do, but it does give you some ability to report on different teams and treat them differently depending on the classification. So while it's all great that you can do it through the app, I have many organizations who do not want that amount of availability to create groups. I have many organizations who are rightly concerned about teams spawning, too many teams spawning, not enough controls around it. And there is a great case to be made for creating teams through an IAM platform. We can make them automated, meaning we can actually take organizational data from an IAM platform and spawn teams based upon the human capital management system. So let's take, for example, departments. When the identity and access management platform sees that there's a new department, it shows up, we can go create a new team, and then we can actually populate that group with those members. We can also open it up to a set selected group of people that have the ability to go into the IAM platform and create a team. We can make those teams joinable through that system because that IAM platform is going to have an approval workflow. That approval workflow is going to be tracked, audited, however that IAM platform that generally already exists in an organization is going to be able to report on that. And then we can put restrictions. We can restrict those users, as I said, to who can request to make teams, who can request to join a certain team. We can really customize the governance side of making a team and joining a team and adding users to a team. So there are many benefits to integrating teams with an IAM platform. As an example, and I've chosen Saviynt here as the IAM platform of choice in my diagram. This could be, I could do this with MIM, I could do this with virtually any IAM platform. I just need the right connectors in place to do it. But for example, I can create groups that are criteria based. I can shoot them over to Azure Active Directory. I can make the necessary PowerShell commands alongside of those calls out to enable them to be a team. I can add users to it. I can onboard the B2B users in my Saviynt platform, make the calls out to the graph to invite those B2B users, keeping in mind I'm keeping those groups out of Active Directory on premise. I'm basically taking my IAM platform, the groups that are within it, and I'm just sending them to Azure Active Directory because they have to be cloud-only groups. And so Active Directory is bypassed as well as Azure AD Connect in this scenario because I'm talking to the graph directly. So teams, roles. So within a team, there are 3 different roles. There is the owner, the member, and there are guests. And they each have their own set of different permissions within the team itself. So I'm not going to read all of those out, but something like create a team, delete a channel, add tabs. Now, there are certain ways, and you see the asterisk by the check marks here, that members, guests can be given access to do that by the owner of the team. So the owner of the team is truly responsible for who has access to do certain things within teams. It's not something I'm really going to talk about managing at this point. This is usually left up to the owner to decide what is applicable for the different user groups inside of the team. When we talk about external users, this can be enabled in Office 365 as far as enabling them for teams. And then there are restrictions about external collaboration settings within Azure AD, mainly around the specific domains that can be added. So either allow invitations sent to any domain, which is basically opening the floodgates, and then you could deny specific domains, or you basically have a pre-approved list that says, yep, these are good, and that's usually it's the most restrictive, but you should probably be able to identify the partners you're working with and the users you're working with. That kind of falls down when you're talking about inviting somebody with a Microsoft account or a Gmail account, because then you basically just have to say, well, I can invite any Gmail user externally. When we look at managing guest access within a team, that owner basically gets to define what the guest permissions should be. Now, we could take that away from the owner by reading in the permissions of the teams and controlling them from a scripting and identity and access management perspective. I have not been asked to do that yet, but you could enforce that. You can't fundamentally turn it off for the owner to have, but I can read it back into any system and then either reverse those permissions that were granted out or leave them be and just report on them. When we talk about Teams identity governance, we really have different mechanisms. And I'm first going to talk about what Microsoft has done with their Azure identity governance tools. This used to be called Azure Access Reviews, but after it came out of preview, they rebranded it to Azure Identity Governance. And what this allows you to do is it allows you to attest to the membership of the group. So you can pick different groups. You can pick applications. So what if you are federating applications in Azure AD? You can pick those, and you can basically say, so I want to run an attestation on these groups of all users or just the guest users of these memberships. And the people who can be slotted to review this access can be the owner of the group, a selected user, or you could have the users do a self-review. I do not see that too often being used. Usually it's the owner of the group who gets to review. And these reviews can be set on a schedule. So let's say every 6 months, every 3 months, however often you want them to review. As far as the terminology within Azure Identity Governance, at the top level is something called a program. And this program can be a collection of access reviews. And the idea behind this was to either tie it to something like departments, specific compliance regulations, applications, however it makes sense in your organization to collectively bundle different access reviews into them. The controls within Azure Identity Governance are individual access reviews. and the controls are linked to a program, right? So programs are at the top, controls are beneath. Another word for controls is access reviews. So it's a bit of a different terminology than what we're used to. They're more so aligning this, I think, to auditors, and so that's kind of what we're used to in that area. Once the Azure Access Review is complete, we have different settings that we can do once the reviewer has completed the access review. We can auto-apply the results to the resource, meaning users that were deemed not part of that group can be yanked. And then we can also do, or we can not do that. We can have the results be able to be exported out and reviewed by someone else who might want to take action. We also have the option to handle if the reviewer should not respond, meaning if a reviewer, maybe they go through and they say 5 people out of the 10, they put the checkbox there, they stop, they go do something else, the review is done, or they just submit it. Then we can have no change on those users. We could, by default, remove access. Say if you did not review these personnel, we're going to remove access. We could say, well, you didn't do that, but we assume that because you didn't say no, we're going to approve access. And then there is the concept of using Azure AD sign-in data, and based upon that recommendation, either remove or approve the access. That recommendation is purely based on when the user last signed in, and I think it's, there's some date, and I can't remember what it is off the top of my head, that it takes into consideration. It says if this user has not signed in X amount of days, then we should approve it. So it doesn't really have any more details than that. This one is a good one, and if you haven't instituted this, I think group expiration is a good one to roll out to an organization. And it can be done in a piloted way, meaning you can selectively take a subset of the entire team's list that you have and narrow it down and kind of pilot it, and then bring it out to the larger organization. But what this is doing is it's basically saying groups will live for X number of days, and then once that timer hits, the owners will get an email to say, yeah, I still need this group, or no, I don't need this group. If it expires, it goes into a deleted state, and there's basically a recycle bin, for lack of a better word. When groups, Office 365 groups are deleted, they go into a recycle bin for 30 days. They can be restored out of that recycle bin. However, once that 30 days passes, then it's gone. The data itself is still archived in Office 365 archive processes, but the group is effectively gone. So as I said, this is very good to throw out to a small pilot group first to kind of run the paces on it. Once you've kind of figured out the tweaks that are going to be needed in the user education for the owners of the groups, then you can decide to roll it out to more groups. Yeah. And this one is new, so this came out kind of recently. And this is actually activity-based user expiration. And it's currently still in private preview, big disclaimer. But what it's doing, this is basically looking for activity on the team to say that if it's active, then it will be automatically renewed. And so some of the things that they're monitoring within this is the SharePoint activity, the Outlook activity as far as joining group and message reading and liking messages, and then the team's access. So when somebody goes into a team, visits the channel, that counts as an activity. So if you want really light touch expiration on your groups, this would be very light touch. However, things may be kind of deleted because, and especially if you look at how we use Teams at Oxford, we do them on kind of a project basis. We use Teams on project basis, and if we didn't have any other policies, which we do, but if we didn't have any other policies, once that project is complete, that team would kind of sit out there and not have anything happen to it. And effectively, if we had this in place, it would be deleted. We put other policies in place to actually extract and archive the data. We use an internal or a SharePoint site where we extract the data from the team, and then it kind of we let it expire and we delete it because we've extracted all that data. If we look at something like Saviynt, I'm going to use Saviynt as an example here because they're a partner of ours and they have a great use case for governance with teams. And they're going to have a lot of similarities with the Azure Identity Governance, but they're going to be able to do a bit more than Azure Identity Governance does. We still have the ability to attest to memberships of a group. We can still break them up between users and guest users. And we can still do the same attest to an application. We do have the ability within Saviynt to do a conditional access grant, meaning once that attestation comes up, we can part of the option a reviewer will have is to say, well, I know they need access for a set period of time, and I'm going to specify that here in this access certification. And once that time period expires, then the user would lose access. Another thing that we can attest to with Saviynt is the need for the group or team's existence. We can also do that with the B2B user. So if we have a B2B user or a group, we can attest to the actual necessary need for that group or team to exist, which is something Azure Identity Governance does not have. So you could fundamentally end up with Azure Identity Governance, you could end up with basically just B2B users with no access, and without going through and culling through them either with a script or manually, they just kind of exist in perpetuity with no access in your directory. As far as who can review in the Saviynt model, really any way you can define a query that defines a relationship between the actual users or groups or B2B users and an owner or a sponsor or somebody who's responsible for those users. And then they can be scheduled on any schedule that you so desire as far as when you want to send those access reviews out. Once they're complete in Saviynt, each access review actually has a global configuration, and depending on how that global configuration is set is how it will process. However, each access review can have its own different completion settings. So there's kind of like it's about to break the glass. So it's basically saying, okay, here's the global one, and then I can have individual parameters for each access review. And ways that we can handle access review remediation in Saviynt. We can remediate the access, which is remove the users from the team, delete the team, open a task in Saviynt for a manual task that needs to be completed by someone. We can open a task in ServiceNow for that manual task. We can export the results without actually performing any automated remediation, and have all that data available to anyone that cares. So as I said, I was going to get to the limitations of teams, and there's a big long list here. I think I just want to kind of highlight some of the high points here rather than just kind of going through all of them. If we jump down to the org-wide team, which is the fourth one down, there does exist the concept of an organizational-wide team, meaning you can go in and create an org-wide team, and there's a limit of 5 of those per organization. However, they have a 5,000 user limit. So just keep that in mind. The number of total teams that you can have in an organization is 500,000. Hopefully, none of you have hit that level yet, that's hopeful. And then you have some things about channels and people in a meeting and the private chat settings. Again, I did this presentation on the internal side of Oxford a couple months ago, I think, and these numbers had changed. So it's a good thing I went out and checked. So this is constantly changing. So again, if you're watching for whatever reason this video in the future, go ahead and check the team's limitations on the docs.microsoft page, because they will change. Data protection. So the best way to do data the data protection is going to involve a lot of different components of Office 365. And I did not have time in my presentation today to really go through all of the different data protection pieces that can be employed with teams. I have given those presentations at different points within webinars or at clients or just speaking at random to strangers on the street. And it's really going to involve a lot of different components, and it's going to depend on what you want to do with your data protection strategy, what you currently are licensed for within the Microsoft EMS stack. But things like Azure Information Protection can be deployed here, and I'm not going to really talk about that in this. What I did want to highlight is the Microsoft CASB, or Microsoft Cloud Applications Cloud Application Security. It's got a long name; it doesn't roll off my tongue that well. And a CASB, which is what this is really that broker between cloud-based resources, which historically we've lost control of. We've lost control of those cloud-based resources, and this is a mechanism to get back that control and get back that investigative capability and policy enforcement capability. I said lost control. We've actually been able to gain more control with CASBs than we previously had when data was being stored on premise. And the CASB, the Microsoft Cloud Application Security, is really actually tightly integrated with a host of Azure features, things that are really relatively new, like Azure Sentinel, which is basically Azure SIEM. And Microsoft Flow for executing remediation tasks or however you want to craft your policies for enforcement. It's also integration with Azure Information Protection, which is the labeling of that content with labels and applying encryption protection to that content. Also integrating with Windows Defender and Azure AD Conditional Access. So really, it's going to look at the entire solution. And when we think about applying this to Teams, we know that Teams is using all of these Microsoft services. So we need something that's actually going to go and look at all of those different pieces. So we talked about SharePoint, OneDrive, Exchange, Azure Active Directory for identity access. The MCAS solution looks at all of those things, has hooks into all of those things, and can handle that. Not only can it do that, and I haven't touched on this, but Teams can be integrated with other third-party solutions outside of the Office 365 stack. That list is growing constantly. And so it has integrations into Dropbox, into Box. You can configure it to work with Google Apps. So we've got more cloud resources that we need to manage. Well, the Microsoft Cloud Application Security has links or APIs and connectors that connect into those systems as well. So we're not solely focused on the Office 365 and Azure stack. We can basically make it broad enough to encompass most of the things. I'm not going to say all, because that is a dangerous precedent to set. But we'll say most of the popular cloud application platforms that you would integrate into Teams to host and store your data. And it's just a quick, I don't have time to run a demo of this, but just a quick overview. Cloud application security is going to allow you to see what's inside of these cloud stores. It's basically going to allow you to create different policies around this different data that's in there. So investigating the actual files that have been, how have they been shared, who have they been shared with, what's in that file, does that file contain things that are that I need to protect more sensitively? Should I quarantine that file so that I can remediate that and figure out either A, who put it up there, why did they put it up there, but I want to quarantine it in that interim time so I don't run afoul of any other regulations I might be violating by having that up there. Looking for not only the content of the files, but also activity by end users. Are there suspicious login attempts? One of the ones that we use internally, and I'm going to transition and talk about Salesforce, is we have this connected to Salesforce, and we're looking, we actually throw a bunch of alerts out when somebody starts downloading a bunch of stuff from our Salesforce. So let's say one of our sales guys was just going to start exporting a bunch of data from our Salesforce. Well, that throws off alarm bells in our system, and we have to go investigate because we want to know kind of what's happening there, because our CRM system is our lifeblood. The same thing is actually set in SharePoint. We have alerts being triggered when somebody's downloading a bunch of content or deleting a bunch of content. You can't hear her right now, but Jackie, our marketing operations manager, is on the line here, and she sets off alerts sometimes, and she wonders why we were able to pick up on some of her activity that throw off these alarms. The last thing here is the ability to actually show where these things sit in the organization, so we can get hierarchical a look at where these items are. And this is going to apply to how they're stored in Teams, right? It's going to be a SharePoint collection, and it won't be OneDrive. But we'll be able to go through, get the hierarchy, view related activity associated with that file. And at the end of the day, you're probably going to want to hook this up to Teams, which is basically just hooking up to Office 365, and read in all the information, start to analyze it, look for trends. Microsoft has some policies that are kind of default that you can customize to make your own, and some of those make sense. And then kind of tweaking those so that they make sense for your organization. There's a lot within this product that should be investigated. And if you're looking at Teams, this one makes the most logical sense to really put a strong perimeter and control around Teams. So that's actually it. I have one more poll before everybody goes, which is if you're interested in learning more about Teams governance, you can go ahead and click yes on that poll there, and we'll be happy to provide you more information. Hopefully I get to speak with you. It's one of my favorite things to do is speak to different organizations and learn what each of you are facing. But thank you for taking the time today, and everybody have a great day.